Hello, everyone. Welcome wherever you are. My name is Shahana Ghosh, and it's with great pleasure that I welcome you to a talk in Brown's seminar series at the Center for Contemporary South Asia. Our speaker today is Nosheen Ali. She's a sociologist serving as global faculty in residence at the Gallatin School, New York University. She researches state-making, ecology, and Muslim cultural politics in South Asia with a focus on Pakistan and Kashmir. She's the author of a fantastic book, um, Delusional States, Feeling, Rule, and Development in Pakistan's Northern Frontier, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2019. She's also the founder of UmangPoetry, a digital humanities initiative for understanding poetic knowledges in South Asia, and Karti Dharti, an alternative learning space for ecological inquiry. So welcome everybody today. It's, as we were just saying, it's strange to be gathered here in this manner because this event was originally planned for spring last semester in conjunction with a class I taught in which we read her book, in which students tremendously enjoyed and were inspired by her work, not just the analysis, but the discussion of the methodological challenges, the very kind of candid reflections on the challenges of doing work on Kashmir. And I'm sure many of those issues will sort of come up as we talk today. Without further ado, we'll begin. But before we do, I'll just mention two things about the way in which this discussion will be structured today. So Nosheen will speak. Please direct your questions and comments, more questions, in the chat box to me, and I will select and moderate questions once Nosheen has finished speaking. I'll pose the questions to her. It would be wonderful if you could please mention your location and or affiliation when you write, because we're aware that people are present, are joining in from all parts of the world. So it would be wonderful. It would allow me to enable and kind of generate conversation across geographies, if that was, if you were able to mention your location. So with that, welcome, Nosheen. We look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
Thank you, Shahana. So apparently people can private message me. I'm already getting private messages from friends. That's okay. Just something so interesting. This friend is sitting in San Francisco and saying hello. So very new Zoom universe of talk giving here. Bismillah, adab to everybody who has joined, and thank you so much, Shahana, the Watson Institute at Brown University, the Center for South Asia, and especially Grace and Stephanie, who have facilitated this talk today. I will begin with a few words from a Gilgiti poet, and I will read. So I'm getting private messages from friends. Hello friends, stop messaging me privately here. I need to present. My friends are crashing the Zoom event. Lovely. So I want to begin with a Gilgiti poet. He's anonymized here. And I will read in Urdu, and in the interest of time, I ask people to read the English by themselves. जुबान को मैंने भी अब बेलगाम छोड़ दिया, अमीर वक्त तेरा एहतराम छोड़ दिया, गिला बजा है कि ए दोस्तों नहीं है बजा, निस्फ सदी से हमें क्यों गुलाम छोड़ दिया, अभी तक है कवानीन डोगरों के यहाँ, अभी तक है कवानीन डोगरों के यहाँ, वो खुद तो चल दिए अपना निजाम छोड़ दिया. I start with the oral poetic because it was a key way, an entry point for me to access the affective experience of state-society relations in Gilgit-Baltistan. And it helped me understand the felt experience of the state. Poetry was nowhere in my original dissertation plan. In fact, I'm trained in the world historical method and political sociology, and my sociologist advisor was very confused. Why has she, stopped looking at proper politics and gone to literature? And it was very interesting, even in the field in Gilgit, my colleagues and peers would be like, she was doing some serious work and now she's meeting poets. So I think it's very interesting that from the realm of proper resistance or proper politics, literature is seen as something of a separate domain, often, especially in academia. And I think one of the arguments I make in the book is about poetic publics and the significance of poetic thought and poetic tradition in the formation of Muslim personhood, but also to understand the history of consciousness that shapes local life worlds, what we in anthropology call local life worlds, and how central epistemologically is this, I would say, emotional affective domain. And I will say more about that later. My work is on Gilgit-Baltistan. Why can't I move the slide on? Okay. Gilgit-Baltistan, as most of you know here, is internationally considered as part of the disputed territory of Kashmir, over which India and Pakistan have long battled, fought several wars. My specific research site within Gilgit-Baltistan was the city of Gilgit, which is marked right here, and the rural space of Shimshal. Gilgit-Baltistan, just to give you an overview, has more than 1.2 million people spread across 800 villages with several ethno-linguistic groups such as the Shina, Wakhi, Balti, Khwar, and Brushiski speaking people. So it's an ethnically diverse space. Religiously, it was once home to animistic and Buddhist traditions. Today, the Shia, Sunni, Ismaili, and Nur Bakshi interpretations of Islam are practiced in the region. Politically, it is an administrative unit governed by Pakistan, but without a constitutional status within Pakistan, without representation in its parliament. It's dominated essentially by the Pakistani military in its political administration, though different setups keep coming and going. Gilgit-Baltistan is also the only Shia majority political unit in Sunni-dominated Pakistan. So the region poses both political and religious identity to an imagined Pakistani national ideology. And it's also an ecologically sensitive zone. It's a global diversity hotspot with rare species of markhor and snow leopard present here. So lots happening in this context where people are simultaneously political, religious, and development subjects. Mm-hmm. And the key question of my book is, how is this status negotiated by people in the region? What does it mean to be part but not part of the Islamic Republic of Pakistan, as well as what a friend and journalist has called increasingly the Intelligence Republic of Pakistan, as because of being a border area, because of being a Shia dominated area, we see what we see in the rest of Pakistan be particularly heightened in this space. And as I will show later, some of the state-making processes that were first tried in Gilgit-Baltistan have also become far more normalized across Pakistan in recent years. I'll begin with what I call affective histories of Kashmir. Kashmir is the essence and rationale, the emotional heart of nationalist ideologies in India and Pakistan. In India, it is called the Atut Ang, inseparable part, limb, or organ, central to Indian states' identity and domination. In Pakistan, it is called the Shahrag, the jugular vein, and is part of what I term savior nationalism, where when I was growing up, like from age 5 onwards, the 9 o'clock news would say, Indian soldiers killed so many Kashmiris today in occupied Kashmir, Maqbooza Kashmir. So in Pakistan, the understanding of Kashmir is Indian occupation, Indian violence, and we hear far less about anything to do with Pakistani Kashmir. Yet there is a deeply humanized and represented understanding of Kashmiri zulm or jabr jo un pe kiya jata hai, but it's still done in a depoliticized way. So for example, Pakistan can promote internationally and nationally Kashmiri haq-e khud iradiyat, which is the right to self-determination, alongside Kashmir banega Pakistan, which is Kashmir will become Pakistan. Now I go into this in detail in the book, but what is interesting to note is the commonality here. And I want to begin our discussion of affective histories by talking about what it means to reduce Kashmir on both sides as a body part, as a toot ang or as shahrag. And I connect it to a masculinist discourse as feminists in Pakistan often talk about being reduced to flesh, being reduced to gosht. And I could not help but make a connection here of this kind of very possession-based proprietary attitude. So the occupying logic is there even in the language, which claims the centrality of Kashmir to our identity. Even the language of key players, there is a very security-centered discourse on Kashmir. There's a communalist discourse on Kashmir. There's let's compare Indian policy to Pakistani policy discourse on Kashmir. But I want to talk about the fascist masculinities that unites these discourses, and why, particularly after visiting the line of control last year in Azad Kashmir on the Pakistani side, it just really dawned on me how Kashmir is the limit of fascist masculinities in both Indian and Pakistani nationalism. Of course, in the name of the Kashmir cause, what is actually happening is that both countries annihilate Kashmiri will and self-annihilate too, with regional proxy wars in Afghanistan and Balochistan, and people have written elsewhere about this. Hate-centered nationalisms have been heightened in India and Pakistan since February 2009. And it's interesting, in this regimes of national security, Kashmir is always permanently unsafe and remains unrepresented. So there is this larger discourse of possession and of hate and of violence. But the story of Gilgit-Baltistan is quite unique and quite interesting. And at the outset, I want to state how diverse parts of the former princely state of Jammu and Kashmir, of spaces that had anything to do with Jammu and Kashmir, have very different histories, very different political trajectories, and very different understandings of how they relate to the countries that are so-called fighting over their land. So in Gilgit-Baltistan, from the perspective of Pakistani nationalism, and which was my sort of training and my first understanding of Gilgit-Baltistan, the previous name of Gilgit-Baltistan was the northern areas, or FANA, federally administered northern areas. And I start the book with how, when I was in grade 7th or grade 8th in Lahore, we had to make a sculptural map of Pakistan. Excuse me. And the areas in the north that today form Gilgit-Baltistan were unmarked, unpeopled, with only Nanga Parbat and Ketu. So this was just a mountainous terrain, very beautiful, very picturesque. The language that is often used is roof of the world, heaven on earth. So if you want to imagine a beautiful Pakistan, you begin and end with Gilgit-Baltistan. This kind of romantic imaginary is what I call the construction of Gilgit-Baltistan as the eco-body of the nation. I'm following here the work of Thongchai Vinichakul on mapping producing the geobody of the region, our understanding of space. But I argue that there's also an emotional understanding of space. And what happens in Gilgit-Baltistan's representation in Pakistani discourse, in textbooks, through its name, through its mapping, I spend a lot of time on the ambiguous and shifting representations of northern areas in Pakistani political discourse, popular discourse, textbook discourse, to highlight the tourist imaginary, an elite bourgeois imaginary through which Gilgit-Baltistan is represented, which contributes to an actual unseeing and an invisibility of the actual territory, its borders, and its people, as well as their oppression. And I have lots of stories in the book. I won't have time to go in detail here about what that invisibility and the silencing of their identity has meant to people in the region. What does it mean to experience illegibility and be reduced to nature? You know, so what does it mean for Pakistanis to connect with this space through emotionally through nature, and what does it mean for people in the region to be reduced to wildlife and parks and, you know, NGO discourses often? So what I argue, again, this is detailed. I mean, it's very hard to expand on it right now, but what I argue is that the region itself is produced as an affect. So you have the larger discourses on Kashmir, which are overflowing with emotion, which are depoliticized, which are often ahistorical, which are even maliciously, you know, propagated by the propaganda machinery on both sides. But then within these, you know, larger discourse of Kashmir, you have different areas like Gilgit-Baltistan, which is produced as an affect through narratives of beauty. And it invokes particular kinds of feelings that shape how one sees, senses, and receives a region. I begin the book with this argument, and I end with also narratives of terror, imperial narratives of terror through the book Three Cups of Tea, which was set in Gilgit-Baltistan and juxtaposes the region with another affect post the war on terror. And I'll see if I have time to go into that in detail. So I'm sort of going from different discursive layers here. What does it mean to inhabit this kind of almost primordial, naturalized, literally naturalized space? One of the terms that is actually used by people in Gilgit-Baltistan, it was the tagline for a popular local newspaper as well, is Sarzamine-e-Be-Ain, which means my land without the constitution, permanently in between state, a state in limbo. I find it very interesting, this term Sarzamine-e-Be-Ain, because I mean, we have seen over the last year only the Pashtun Tahaffuz movement talking about the constitution. We have seen in India, Chandrasekhar Azad talking about the Indian constitution. And it's very interesting to read Kashmiri voices and Gilgit-Baltistani voices, which have been harping on for 70 years on why we are without the constitution. And this feeling of what does it mean to be under arbitrary rule, to have no semblance of political representation and voice and decision making in what affects the region. I wrote a master's thesis on it. It would be in my interviews, but I think even I didn't feel it, honestly speaking, till 2007 when Musharraf declared his emergency, General Musharraf. And I was in Karachi at the time. I was in the middle of my fieldwork. It was 2007, and you know, overnight, lots of judges, activists, I think over 1,000 people were arrested. He just pressed delete on the constitution, deleted the Supreme Court literally, and just rule by force, direct and in your face. And I had called a friend in Gilgit, a journalist friend. I said, "Aapne dekha kya ho raha hai? Are you seeing what's happening? This is so crazy. It's so unprecedented. Who does he think he is?" And he was utterly calm, and he was like, that's how we are living for the last many decades. Why are you so surprised? You're just getting to experience what we've always known. And I think that just, you don't know it till you experience it. I just wanted to share that experience of being without the constitution, um, what that means, what that meant to me at that moment in my fieldwork, realizing that pain and that anguish. Um, the other story about political subjectivity that I want to share is that when I interviewed people during the 9 months of ethnographic research that I did, there would be a strong sense of love, longing, and betrayal in the way they express citizenship. So I will often hear, हमने तो पाकिस्तान से मोहब्बत की, लेकिन पाकिस्तान ने धोखा दिया. We loved Pakistan, but it betrayed us. Even last year, the AJK Prime Minister was saying that if this will be the attitude, the callous attitude of the state, तो दूरियां बढ़ जाएंगी. Our distances will grow. And the term bewafai would come very often. The term would come, Pakistan is insincere with us. And a strong yearning और एक तरसना जिसको मैं कहूंगी would be expressed for regarding the denial of belonging and regarding the desire for belonging. This I expand on in the book is both an aspiration for, I mean, it's not that they're not aware of the violence of the state, but it's about the reality of being stateless in some ways, in terms of rights, that is very emotionally experienced. Now, again, in my political sociology discourse, I did not know what to make of this very, what I at that time thought is such an over emotional way to think about Pakistan. Why are they talking about love? I'm here to talk about rights and, human rights and violence and disenfranchisement. Terms in English, terms dominated by academic rhetoric. And here I am at a protest and people are saying Pakistan ne hamare ehsasat ke saath khela hai, which literally means Pakistan has played with our emotions, or Pakistan has manipulated our emotions. So I take this language seriously and theorize it by talking about the emotional logic of oppression and state making. And I argue that Pakistan, from the view of many in Gilgit-Baltistan, is seen as a state of manipulated love. So the poetics of love becomes a way to understand both state making and citizenship. And I connect it to work that has been done on love as a political emotion, love as an expansive emotion, as an attachment to social and ecological space. This is work done by one of my advisors, Anne Gold. I also draw upon my own work, which is on love struggles in popular legend in South Asia and on poetic knowledge. When you look at Heer Ranjha and Sassi Pannu and Soni Mahiwal and how much political discourse has happened through popular legend, I say that the history of all hitherto existing society does not look like a history of class struggles. It looks like a history of love struggles. And it's exactly this kind of love struggle that you find in the way Gilgitis aspire for belonging within a Pakistani nation state. And the kind of social emotionality that they express is connected to why Bacha Khan, why Gandhi had such a resonance, right? There is something about the language of the heart being used to challenge a language of violence. In the making of the social contract. And this is why, staying with the emotional terrain, the resistances that I focus on in the book are poetic, educational, and ecological, which are mostly understudied, which may not even be seen as proper resistance often because they don't look like sort of, they're not part of the dominant discourse of politics, let's say. But they talk about insaniyat, they talk about challenging greed, they talk about stewardship towards nature. Again, very ethical, intimate orientations towards land and towards identity. So this was about how the state is experienced. And a little bit about that. I will shift gear and talk about what I mean by delusional states. What India and Pakistan are doing these days, it's evidently clear what I mean by delusional states. But the understanding of the riyasat or the state in my interviews was very interesting and challenging to, again, the discourses of the state in mainstream sociology weren't helping me too much. We have garrison state, we have security state, but what is happening with India and Pakistan in Kashmir is another level, right? So we've heard stories about pigeons being arrested at the border, accused of being suspicious. I discuss in the book about how a group of special children went from Gilgit to India to attend this Special Olympics there, and how my friends were harassed for a month by multiple intelligence agencies about what is the purpose of these special children? Why were they sent? So this extraordinarily paranoid, arrogant, hyper-intelligence-sized space, choti si jagah hai, but it's a small space, but people used to say to me, yahan har dusra banda jasoos hai, every other person is a spy here. And I'd be like, come on, that's an exaggeration. And very soon you find out how students have been asked to spy on teachers. I mean, how routine it has become as a source of living that, a taxi driver would say to me randomly that, oh, I used to work for and spy for intelligence agency, but the income wasn't enough, so I decided to get a taxi. It's a mode of employment. It's an ordinary fact. And this rule by agencies is also an ordinary fact in Sindh. It's also now an ordinary fact in Punjab and elsewhere in Pakistan. But in a lot of discourses of state formation, this kind of domination of the force apparatus is not theorized with the kind of destruction and that it entails, or that people communicated to me. So I argue that, Rose and others have talked about the role of fantasy as a feature of the modern state, but the sense of delusion that one finds in the discourse in Pakistan. And here, what I mean by delusion, I'm drawing upon the wonderful work of Anne McClintock on paranoid empire. So Anne McClintock is analyzing Abu Ghraib and these extraordinary prisons outside the US, and she calls them the shadowlands of empire. And she talks about catastrophic self-delusion as characterizing empire. So simultaneous beliefs of persecution and grandeur, where fantasies of global omnipotence combine with nightmares of impending attack. When I read global omnipotence and beliefs of grandeur, I immediately thought of the Pakistani state. The rhetoric that you hear, the kind of culpability with which they have been operating. So I was very taken by her work, and I put the US and Pakistani states in a transnational frame through what Philip McMichael calls incorporated comparison rather than a random comparison, because spaces are next to each other. And I argue that Pakistan is in fact a shadowland of empire. These are not just extraordinary prisons that like Abu Ghraib that McClintock talks about. This paranoia then fuels regimes of surveillance and highly militarized societies. So this is where the argument for delusional states comes from. On the ground, what this means is hyper-intelligentization, the production of suspicious subjects, of subjects who are considered treacherous, untrustworthy, but also suspicion within subjects. And I'll talk about that in a moment. I'll first read a quotation from a journalist about what does it mean to inhabit this space of surveillance and suspicion. It is like thought control. So many of us live in fear and are afraid to freely discuss anything in public. What if there's a spy around? Last week, when I sent a report about the region to a newspaper in down country under a pseudonym, I first got a threatening warning on phone, then through an agent who came to my house. They do this to remind us that they know where we live, where our families are. This ghatiya, debased pressure is brutal. We have to ask, who benefits from this system? By denying us our rights and holding us in fear and suspicion, it is the military establishment that benefits because they want to maintain their unchecked privileges. I want to contrast this suspicion with also an intense form of loyalty that people in Gilgit-Baltistan feel towards the Pakistani state. So this is both a paradox and an overlapping sensibility, because military labor was the first form of wage labor in the region that dates back to the Gilgit Scouts. And I trace how the honor system and shahadat system and the notion of sacrifice for the military plays into producing an affect of loyalty towards the state as well. But that loyalty that is shown towards the Pakistani army, because there are so many shaheed from the NLI, from Gilgit-Baltistan, who have lost their lives for Pakistani military wars and in operations, is also increasingly critiqued. And the intelligence domination is more and more being visible. It wasn't as visible even when I was doing my fieldwork. The related aspect of suspicion, as I said, is the production of sectarianism. I mean, I kind of try not to use the term sectarianism because it takes you to Shia, Sunni, primordial, always fighting. I even argue in the book that this minority-majority discourse following poets actually has to go. It is fundamentally unhelpful in the way we think about religious identity, in the way we think about political subjectivity. So what has happened is that the delusional state of Pakistan in Gilgit-Baltistan, and we see it increasingly in Karachi and in Sindh, especially over the last 2 weeks, is what is called by people in the region as calculated disorder, where the state practices divide and conquer. These are terms from my interviews, tactics through which Maulvis from both sects are paid to fight each other. People with weapons and hate-centered discourses are protected. In the 70s particularly, this was a time of heightened secular nationalist aspirations. I will not be able to go into the moments. There are 3 moments I spend a lot of time in the book: the 1970s, 1988, and the 2000 textbook controversy. But here I just want to indicate that there is a history to the use of religion to thwart secular aspirations, to thwart political liberation of Gilgit-Baltistan, well understood in the region, yet it produces on a day-to-day basis intense sectarian discord. So we have seen more pluralistic ties in the past, particularly when I have interviewed women, and I've documented that in the book. People did not know who was Shia or who was Sunni. Often there is a strong tradition of intermarriage in the region. Ilakiyat, or where you're from, was more significant than sect. But because of state policies, other histories as well, and especially because of the Afghan jihad during the Cold War. And I want to center that because we often say in the US that, you know, the blowback of the Afghan war began in 9/11. Well, for Pakistan, it began right when the war was ending. So famously, the Lashkars and Mujahideens on the way out of Afghanistan attacked Gilgit-Baltistan and what is locally known as the 1988 ka Wakia, which is 1988 pogrom. I mean, I've called it genocide here because some say 800, some say 1,000. No proper accountability has happened for this organized state violence, where 12 villages were brutally attacked and very novel forms of physical and cultural annihilation were practiced. If there is a Shia and Sunni couple who've been married, they've been divorced and asked to perform the right nikah, the Sunni way. The Shias have been asked to recite the kalma again. Animals have been slaughtered, crops have been burnt. And this is in people's memory. I mean, I will interview a woman student and she'll remember when she was 8 years old and her village was attacked and why she feels so scared about attacks in Gilgit-Baltistan even today. So again, I won't get too much time to spend on this, but I want to indicate that the delusional state, beyond omnipotence, beyond senses of persecution, where they feel that they're under threat and must sort of blanketly abolish all dissent, all political participation, as we're seeing in India and Pakistan, is also fueled by this idea that if we make the locals fight each other, then the state becomes the agent of law and order, the uniting force. So the securocratic interest of the state then trump this space. Again, the affective construction is interesting, and I detail it in the book, where this place is where, you know, the uncompromising elements of the two sects can just erupt, right? So the state has nothing to do with it. It's just this very sentimental space where कभी भी लड़ने के लिए लोग आ जाते हैं और बहुत इनके narrow minds हैं. And again, this is a reduction of political, I mean, they're not properly political subjects because they're religious subjects, right? And I think a lot of, there are even liberal progressive ways in which the clergy might be seen as, you know, irrational. These are irrational subjects. So I want to signal that construction here as well. How am I doing on time? Okay. So the last part of the book, again, nobody teaches you how to give a book talk, and it's very hard to give a comprehensive view. I'm just trying to touch on some of the key arguments. The last section of the book is called Saving Nature, Saving People, where I look at development as neoliberal conservation and development as empire and counterinsurgency. This is the book, 3 Cups of Tea, that I indicated earlier. What I find interesting about this is that often, I mean, when I've asked a minister, a Pakistani minister appointed to Gilgit-Baltistan's political setup, you know, what about political rights? And they would say, itni development di hai. We have given so much development there. They have so much more than even Thar, even other parts that are part of Pakistan. So development is often used as a way to not give rights, and again, it dovetails the security discourse. Right? Today, development has become very linked to CPEC, which is the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. And I'll get to that in a bit. But I wanted to signal these other experiences, the real experiences of development, which are tied to imperial conservation and humanitarian narratives. So Gilgit-Baltistan would often be described as the living museum for wildlife, because, you know, it's such a rich biodiversity area. So the eco body that I talked about in construction, in lived practice, also means that increasingly nature is used by the state to occupy more and more land. The occupation of land is also happening directly by state agencies, but parks become an indirect way of territorializing as well, a disputed territory. And, you know, saving nature, I mean, conservation is seen as such a good thing, as one author describes it, I forget the author's name, as the apex of affective agency in an age of climate change, right? Everyone must care for nature. But the way the environmentalist discourse that has actually been instantiated on the ground with what appears to be harmless, lack of local capacity, livestock as a threat to wildlife, community-based hunting licenses for conservation, I look at these discourses which have now become deeply entrenched in local psyches as conservation, sustainability as a means for earning an income through wildlife, which was not the case earlier. There is a huge demeaning of agro-pastoral livelihoods happening in this discourse. Again, details in chapter 5, but I wanted to signal how this logic of nature keeps coming up in the way Gilgit-Baltistan has become seen even by international NGOs. Then I discussed the epistemic challenge from the Shimshal Nature Trust in the region, which argues for what I call ecological sovereignty rather than, community participation. Will not have time to discuss this. And I'm not sure how many of you are familiar, but 3 Cups of Tea was this horrible text that became very popular right when I finished fieldwork. And even my Pakistani friends who did not know where Gilgit-Baltistan was, it was called Northern Areas at that time. People would ask me, "Aap Peshawar ja rahi hain? Where exactly are you going? Are you going to Fata?" So this very blurred area, like I said, it's an unpeopled area. It's filled with mountains only, and for trekking, it's very good. And then this book comes and everybody starts reading it, and a coffee shop person in the middle of upstate New York, I mean, I go to get coffee and she's reading that book and she's like, "Oh, you're from Pakistan, have you read 3 Cups of Tea?" I'm like, oh my god, this is a best-selling book in Pakistan, where Pakistanis are apprehending their sort of understanding of their, it's already an unseen space, really politically, and then you are seeing it through a white knight narrative. And then there are students here who are understanding it, who are understanding Gilgit-Baltistan and Pakistan through such a narrative, which is steeped in counterinsurgency. It's steeped in arrogance of empire. I again detail this in the book, where it's very deceptive because it seems to be very concerned about education in a region, but it completely erases to the extent of fabrication. There are so many lies in the book, and I've tried to be as academic as possible in my analysis. And I was often told, I should say this here, Shahana, you and I have had the conversation, that when I first wrote the chapter, I was told, you sound indignant, because obviously with imperial politics and with such horrible narratives, you're supposed to be polite, you know. So there's very interesting where this tone policing happens in academia, and the kind of imperial epistemic privilege when it's challenged by especially a Pakistani woman who's Muslim with a Muslim name. These feelings are also central to where your academic knowledge production is regulated. I think 6 months after I wrote that chapter, the guy was exposed. His institute was a fraud. I was asked to give court appearances. People in Gilgit-Baltistan also, I faced a lot of attack from them because, have you done any humanitarianism? Because this guy is so great. And he's still great. I mean, remember, these legacies of empire are very entrenched, right? But the disbelief that people had, even anthropologists, from India, who were like, I mean, yeah, but it's a very convincing narrative, right? So how it's linked to empire and military is something I unpack in the book. But I wanted to, I mean, we talk a lot about Foucault and truth and power, and I really wanted to talk about lies and power, and how we really need to start talking about lies far more.
Nosheen,
Yeah.
maybe you could start wrapping up on that note. We have lots and lots of questions that will, I think, invite you to speak on many other aspects. So,
okay. So I will wrap up with 2 points. One is the current state, where we know that there's talk of a 5th province with no Gilgit-Baltistani voice, from what is understood at the moment, and the use of what is known as Schedule 4 of the Anti-Terrorism Act against more than 100 journalists and activists in the region. There are 11 activists who were arrested a while back, including Baba Jan, who's a prominent leftist leader. So we have under CPEC, under this new development mantra of China-Pakistan collaboration, China was once seen as a very harmless benefactor. Now people see it as an East India company. So this narrative has also changed just in the last decade. And it poses huge ecological and political challenges in the current moment. So I wanted to share that. I will not have time to talk about poetic resistances, which I wanted to get into, but I'll end with a poem. because I started with one. Just skip. How do I move this? Okay. किसने कौम को पूजा, किसने नोटों के अवतारों को, हम तो सबको जानते हैं, दस्तारों को, सरदारों को, जिनकी हर एक किश्त में हमने अपनी चाहत बोई थी, जिनकी हर एक किश्त में हमने अपनी चाहत बोई थी, खून से रंगी होते देखा हमने उन गुलजारों को, हमको है ये ज़ौम, हुसैनी सब्र हमारा विरसा है, हमको है ये ज़ौम, हुसैनी सब्र हमारा विरसा है, और निखारो और सवारो तुम अपनी तलवारों को. Thank you.
So wonderful. Thank you, Nosheen. This is actually not an end because there are a lot of questions that actually ask you more about poetry and poetic publics. So maybe I can just ask you a few questions that would allow you to speak on
Yes.
exactly that part, that you wanted to elaborate on. So I'll begin with, I'll club a few of those questions, and please, this is to invite all of our more than 150 participants. Please keep putting in your questions in the question box, and I'll try and read them and collect them and pose them to Nosheen. So from Muntazir Ali of Religious Studies at Brown University, could you please speak more about the place of poetry in Gilgit-Baltistan? How are those who produce poetry perceived by those who consume it? There was a previous question by Drew Kerr at UCSD about a sort of longer question about the role of poetry in kind of destabilizing dominant ideas, dominant notions of nationalism, but also what it means to be part of poetic publics. You kind of you opened with this very evocative idea of the importance of poetic publics, of paying attention to poetic publics in understanding political subjectivity and in understanding political resistance, the formation of political resistance. And so what does it mean to be part of poetic publics? So maybe you can start with, sort of telling us a little bit more about
Sure.
Those dimensions.
Muntazir and Drew for these questions. It's amazing how when we think about how Pakistan was created, the kind of, there's an argument by Vinay Dharwarkar amongst others about how literary nationalism preceded political nationalism. And when we were growing up in Pakistan, they would say, Iqbal ne khwab dekha. It was a dream of Allama Iqbal that Pakistan should be made, and so Pakistan became. So the power of the poetic imagination, as I said earlier, is central to Muslim life worlds, personhood, especially in northern Pakistan, and especially in more rural areas, perhaps, more agro-pastoral areas, where, so poetry, when we think of the English term poetry, we think of, I don't know, Emily Bronte over a lake, or, sitting. It's an isolated process. It's a textual process. What happens in Gilgit-Baltistan is that there are 400 people. It's a night-long mushaira, at least for 4 hours. It's amongst the mountains, so I've seen lit up mountains with what is called chiraga. And I would be in the Karakoram International University there with students, with teachers, very male space. I could be there because I'm not a local, and I could be there with women poets who were not local. Things have changed slowly, obviously, but these tend to be male public arenas, though largely people know with collective consciousness what the poets are saying. So these are, in essence, spaces of a community dialogue, right? The mushaira ethic, the Mela ethic, the Rath Jaga ethic has a spiritual background as well. But these are spaces of what I call moral intellectual struggle, where identities are being formed and reshaped. Now, many of the people there, I mean, of course, there's a yearning for the Pakistan state, but I noticed that critical shairi, critical poetry challenging the meaning of Islam, reasserting the pluralistic faith or what is called true faith, as opposed to the abuse of religion and the abuse of Islam under Pakistani state formation. This is very direct, and I'm very grateful to Ali Mir, who's written a fantastic book called Anthems of Resistance. And when I'd given him my paper for feedback, he pointed out that, you know, it's to make fun of the wise or the mullah or the sheikh is very, very strong lineage, Farsi shairi, Urdu shairi, Punjabi shairi. But what Gilgit-Baltistanis are doing, what the poets there are doing is, you know, तासुब से भरा पैगाम ये है, भाव खून दर से आम ये है, मुसलमानों का जब अंजाम ये है, मैं काफिर हूं अगर इस्लाम ये है. They are openly saying that the message of Islam has become shed blood and prejudice, and if this is your Islam, I am a kafir. And these lines are not just, you know, they would come up in my interviews. They would come up with my conversations in students. These are not some, you know, or text who has read it. These are, it becomes a voice of the people. It becomes a way to articulate social being. It becomes a way in which you inhabit an understanding of politics. So to feel politics, to feel rule in the region, the poetic is an important affective register. It absolutely destabilizes the nation. It empowers a very different understanding than the nation. It challenges the divisiveness of the nation. In fact, the last poem I read, you know, the poet is saying that you call us traitor and Gaddar, but we know that you are feeding the traitors. This is the military militant axis. So they are very open in their critique. Yet they might be pro army, they are very pro Pakistan, they love Pakistan, they will say dharti hamari Laila hai, hum iske Majnu hai, this land is our Laila and we are mad about it. So lots of dynamics are there. In terms of how it's consumed through song, it's consumed through dance that is often follows poetic gathering. There's a very vibrant cultural public sphere in Gilgit-Baltistan in different languages.
Wonderful, thanks. On that, sort of on the note you ended on about how people, you know, relate, as you've said, so you've kind of brought it out so wonderfully in your book, and you spent a bit of time unpacking that today, this kind of relationship of love, betrayal, trust. So there was a question which from a student at SOAS who says, you pointed out that the people of Gilgit-Baltistan do feel loyalty. Uzair Ibrahim is his name. You point out that the people of Gilgit-Baltistan do feel loyalty to the state, even as they are aware and critical of the state and military violence. Would this also, in a sense, be a kind of nationalism, a belief in the project of Pakistan, despite the fact that it has failed the people of Gilgit-Baltistan? And if you don't mind, can I just pose a few questions to you, and, you know, you can choose sort of how you want to answer them, and, you know, with the knowledge that you perhaps won't be able to get to all the questions, and please.
Okay, why don't you do that?
Is that okay? Because the questions are really pouring in, so I'm also trying to keep up with them. So please forgive me.
Go ahead. I'll take maybe 3 questions at a time.
Yeah, let's take a few. So there are a couple more about sort of broadly around resistance. So one from Arjuma Malik on where does the feminist resistance lie in the region? And how does the idea of independent statehood for Kashmir play out in Gilgit-Baltistan? That's one question. And there was a previous one of the earliest questions from Rafe Mansouri, who's a recent graduate in Karachi, asking about a contradiction slowly unveiling in Gilgit-Baltistan vis-a-vis these surveillance regimes, asking you if you see that there is a sort of contradiction which is slowly becoming visible in Gilgit-Baltistan, in the sense that, you know, for surveillance systems are predicated on people being afraid of losing something. And now I'm just reading the question: as Pakistan and India increasingly encroach on Kashmiri lives through force, lies, etc., they seem to be pushing Kashmiris to a point where the latter realize that they have nothing to lose but their chains. I've heard of groups fighting back against Indians. Has this desire for freedom, even at the expense of their lives, found its way into Kashmiri poetry and general literature? He asks. So, yeah, I'll keep it, some in different directions, but sort of broadly maybe about expressions of resistance or kind of diagnosing the relationship with the state and what is there to lose.
Yeah. Great question, Uzair. Uzair is a former student of mine. Very happy with that question, Uzair. Thank you. You're right. You're right. It is a form. It's an aspiration. I think in 1947, the idea of a Muslim homeland needs to be taken seriously, as opposed to Hari Singh dominated Dogra state, as opposed to the experience of a Hindu nation or what that reality might mean. And not just in Gilgit-Baltistan. And this love that people feel, I mean, I want to say it's a different kind of love than patriotism. It's a love of those who've been dispossessed, who have been betrayed, so who are permanently stuck in the not yet part of the nation, right? So it is nationalistic, and yet it's talking about respect and dignity. It's talking about tiredness from being denied the status of equals, right? So in that way, it contests the dominant notion of nationalism as well. The question about feminist resistance, great question. I have not done enough research on that. I do know that there is far more participation of women in the public sphere today than when I was even doing fieldwork. Most political discourse, as is true in many other parts of Pakistan at least, is still male-centric and it's masculinist, right? So just because women participate doesn't mean that the discourse is feminist. So I just will say that. But I see my book as feminist resistance as well. I think there is scholarship on Kashmir. I organized a conference across the line of control or beyond the lines of control, because there's the line of control and then there's the intellectual line of control, where for a long time people who worked on both sides could not even communicate, right? Or did not. There's far more conversation now, and all the people I had invited happened to be women. So women are taking on the question of militarism and militarization in far more provocative ways, from comparative literature, from sociology, from anthropology. And yeah, I wanted to acknowledge the feminist resistance that exists in the form of even unpacking this communalist security-centered discourse. The last question about fear, again, these are brilliant questions. Thank you, everybody. There is a lot of fear, in a way. Gilgit-Baltistan has had a special status within the Pakistani setup. So people are like, what if we were part of Pakistan? Will we be treated the way Balochistan has been treated? Right? So, and the way the ATA has been used, the way new laws are being promulgated that will take away land ownership. I mean, again, this is like urti khabrein ki ji ye aane wala hai, but we have reason to believe that the delusional state that has already existed here, the militarized, very colonial forms of rule that have been used in the region, might further deepen as they're deepening in the rest of Pakistan. What people will do remains to be seen. I am very excited by young progressive politics, young people taking part in politics increasingly. But my concern is that regional political parties have been suppressed in the region. So, they have to ally with PMLN or PPP, which is great, which is important, but maybe it's my own sentiment, but I have seen in Sindh and KP where resistance in a regional form is absolutely essential to enhancing local decision-making, participation, voice.
Thanks so much, Nosheen, both for the response and for actually, as you said, for these really excellent questions, and that we're able to, I think what I value so much about this is that we're able to have a conversation, as you say so importantly, which is able to put in conversation, not just comparisons between, say, a Balochistan and a Gilgit-Pakistan, Azad Kashmir and occupied Kashmir in India, but really kind of thinking in connected ways about what these struggles in these different places mean about rule of power, and what are some of the languages and vocabularies with which we can articulate conversations, and kind of and the limits of, not to kind of throw out terms such as solidarity or resistance in any easy kind of way, but to think about the limits and the possibilities of these comparisons and where they hold and where they don't. I don't want to miss the actually very first and important question, I think, that came, which is from Shabana, who's based in the US, but her family comes from Poonch in POK. And she asks, how does caste fit into your research and understanding of the affective histories of Kashmir? I ask because the narratives of upper caste, mainly Sayeds and Zamindars, dominate even Kashmiri-centered voices. That's one question. And again, I'll group a few actually quite different questions, but see what you can answer, and then maybe that will be the last set of questions we have for now, because we're already out of time. Another question was, could you speak about the role of CPEC in keeping Gilgit invisible, and how has the state violence increased in terms of CPEC?
Okay.
And let's see. Lots and lots of questions, and my apologies to those that I'm not able to do justice to.
I'm here.
Okay, so another one.
We don't have to empty the room. Well,
yeah, another one, actually, in the interest of, expansive thinking transnationally and about expansive geographies, a question about the 1988 genocide. Zagum says, we grew up listening to these tales of the 1988 genocide, which in popular vocabulary is known as 88 tensions. Just wanted to ask, how far do you think the Iranian Revolution of 1979 and the subsequent Shia political activism was responsible for the growing distrust between the state and Shias in Gilgit-Baltistan? Scholars have argued that after 79, Shias in Gilgit-Baltistan and elsewhere started looking towards Iran for ideological and financial assistance, resulting in the erosion of trust between Shias and the Pakistani state. Do you agree with this thesis? So maybe you can take these.
So the first question was caste. The second was 1980. The third was 1988. Beach wala kya tha?
CPEC and the invisibility, how it continues the invisibility and the relationship with state violence.
Shabana, I think it's it's an excellent question that you have posed, and I have insufficient knowledge about that in terms of Gilgit-Baltistan. Yeah, I can just say that, I was looking at how a border is made. My work started with that, with looking at processes of representation, militarization, sectarianization, and conservation, particularly these 4 processes. So I did not investigate caste or tribe, Shin Yishkun, all kinds of details of that aspect of sociology and anthropology in the region. My concern was with political dispossession, and of course, there's so much one can do in a text, but that is a great question. CPEC is another hallucination. That's all I will say. When I went to Gilgit last year, the fictitiousness of what is claimed, what exists, is mind-blowing. Of course, there's an amazing tunnel that has been made and that has been lumped under CPEC, but CPEC is increasingly been used for land grabbing all over Pakistan, to harass activists. Whatever you want to do in Thar, if you want to do Thar coal, you lump it with CPEC. So it's become a mantra again, in a similar way that the Dyamar Bhasha Dam became this sort of a megalomaniacal, maniacal vision of development, illusion sold to everybody. And again, there's a savior rhetoric to that, where Imran Khan will save the nation by creating this fantastical dam. There's this fantasticness to this sort of our affection for the high-tech visions and high-power visions of development mean huge political engineering on the ground, and spatial laws that have to be put in place. Lots of people I've spoken to in Gilgit-Baltistan are very concerned about losing village property and encroachment on their lands. In fact, protest videos have started coming out as well. So Pakistan now has cyber crime laws. I mean, I'm concerned that this is being videoed. Well, it's all in the book either way, but people for writing a tweet have had our Electronic Crimes Acts used against them. A very famous activist, Gulala Ismail, her parents just a couple of days back, I mean, this is how human rights activists are being harassed today. The parents have been accused, who are in Pakistan, of, what is it? Being part of terrorist attacks on Shia Imam Bargas and Christian churches. So this is the way the state has, it's unreal almost, the way in which it can lump you with court cases with no connection to what is happening, because I think the fascism is becoming clear and clear, right? And CPEC is one discourse that helps to shield a very long-standing tradition of denying locals say in their own spatial decision making. 1988. Zaigam, thank you for your question. Again, this is a very critical question, right? The role of Iran, the role of what is often called the Shia revival. I also think it is used to not tackle head-on a Sunni privileging state. For example, when we talk about Islamization, right? Zian Islamization, General Zia's Islamization, it's in our Pak Studies papers as well. Why do we call it Islamization and not Sunniization? This understanding that the universal, neutral, one Islam that we are often told, why do you talk about sects? There is one Islam. It's important, and what has exacerbated is a long history of a Sunni privileging state. The Shia revolution, happens in 1979, but I look at earlier dynamics. Aisha Jalal, in her book, The State of Martial Rule, talks about as early as the 1950s, what was happening with minorities against minorities as well, when we look at attacks on Ahmadis. So I think we have slowly gone the route of course, with the Cold War, I think it's a very significant to mention that when you create more than 100,000 mujahideen who come from all over, and you create new curriculum and you create new madrasas and you weaponize them with millions of dollars, and you never undo that, right? And then when girls' schools are being blown up, 400 girls' schools were blown up in all over KP. This is 2007 onwards. So we are seeing the heightening of sectarian hostility. I mean, this both sides perspective needs to be tamed. That's what I'm saying. I'm not denying, of course, Shia violence. But this just, we have to understand what the state is backing up, what is the scale that we are talking about. So what caused 1988? An exclusionary nationalist project built fundamentally on a sectarianized vision, if you ask me, sort of historically and politically. And we are seeing through many events that layer being unpeeled and unravel in front of our eyes. It begins with Jinnah getting 2 burials. Because he's Shia, he can't, his public burial is very different than a private burial, right? So the sectarianization of the state is prior to the Iranian Revolution, and we need to consider that history. And of course, historians will then bring up colonial logics of enumeration and what that did to further divisions.
More on the, so there's a question asking you about how the Hunza's emergence as a big tourist destination impacts the Pakistani public imagination, public view of Gilgit-Baltistan, and if this kind of direct contact has actually increased understanding. And if I may add, to that question, I had a thought while you were talking. I was very, it came across quite in this kind of condensed version of the book in this talk, Nosheen, when you were talking about, I was so struck by the way you spoke of the way in which sectarian, the space of Gilgit-Baltistan, these are, as a sentimental space, these are not properly political subjects. The way you put it was so powerful, that these are not properly political subjects, but can only be considered as religious subjects in the way in which sectarian strife is framed and represented. But at the same time, in the framing of the ecological, this kind of naturalized eco-diversity space, they're also framed as kind of naturally ecological subjects.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if there's a natural link to the tourism question and what happens in the national imaginary, but I'm wondering is there a tension in this, the naturalized religious subject and the naturalized empathetic, compassionate, ecological subject in the imaginary of that? Or do you see any inherent, is there a contradiction, a tension in that? Or if there, if there is there some effort to make those consistent? Or
I think that's a great question. Let me say hello to Ali Muhammad, who's my nephew and has
wow.
signed in from Alabama. How exciting is that? Hi, Ali. आपने जो कहा शहाना, naturally ecological subject. It's a natural space without subjects. It's there for Pakistani consumption, right? That's the romantic vision with idyllic images of the long living Hunza cuts and of course very khubsurat glaciers.
And K2.
And K2. But the ecological subjects, I mean, when you look at development discourse and conservation discourse, is often looked at them as, the peasant mentality. Their livestock is overriding the prestigious wildlife that the world has to preserve. I mean, meanwhile, the world has killed off its own wildlife. At least it should ask, why is there so much wildlife in Shimshal? Maybe they're doing something right. But no, we're not going to ask that question. We are going to assume that they have been irresponsible. And in my interviews with the DFO, conservation architects, like, people, यहाँ के लोग मतलब illiterate है ना? The people are illiterate. This land, you've asked a brilliant question. I should think more about this. This notion that people are illiterate because you're an agro-pastoral, also citizenship-less space. तो सबको एक landlordism wali mentality aa jati hai, right? The mentality is that the peasants are illiterate. Acha, why is sectarianism happening? Jahalat, illiteracy, ignorance. Then Mr. Greg Mortensen comes in 3 cups of tea and says, this place, poor people, poor people are illiterate people are extremist people, and so we must save them through education. This connection, so they're not seen as people who can take care of their own lands, not in mainstream discourse, right? They are seen as uh, too sentimental, sectarianized, um, and often illegal. Very now you're rendering them illegal encroachers, right? When you are in a national park and you've landed from New York and Bronx Zoo, I mean, you know, the history of the Khunjarab National Park is crazy, and we know this, how this has happened all over Africa and Latin America, where wilderness has been imposed on inhabited landscapes, and today histories of that cohabitation are being used again, reframed as Western discourse, and said, acha humne aapko ab naya plan sikha diya hai, now we have given you a new language. Okay, first we were maybe a bit oppressive, now so you've taken it from people's understanding and again put it in some English Anglo-centric garb, right? But the denial of representation is there. The denial of epistemic equality is there throughout in all these visions. So thank you for helping me articulate that. Then as opposed to this, right? So I'll get to the second question, the picturesque Hunza. It really annoys me. मुझे बहुत चिढ़ चढ़ती है, because you're seeing and writing how in popular discourse, in textbooks, you have this very depoliticized understanding with no understanding about and no idea that there are inhabitants who are different from you. Many people in the region will tell me we are often confused for being from KP. People don't even know we exist, right? And what this picturesqueness has done is, I think at some level, this elite imaginary dovetails the military elitism that you see in the region, right? This is an environmental hub. This is a liberal space, which is the other Pakistan. I mean, you are, you know, in ordinary languages in Karachi and Lahore, Shia Kafir rallies are happening. Smileys are considered even more Kafir than Shias. And when you go to Hunza, you are claiming that this is a feminist, liberal, idyllic space. I find that very problematic. I find that, it's not feminist. The violence at home remains in the same ways that it exists in the rest of Pakistan. But the fact that Hunza has largely a Smiley population means better gender relations than compared to maybe other communities, right? So I think it's important to recognize why diversity, why Muslim diversity is central to the space being perceived as more of a breathing space, and to connect it to a very annihilatory logic of state formation in Pakistan, which is Zegam's point as well, that we can't sort of keep blaming Iran and Saudi Arabia. They are to be blamed. America is to be blamed even more, as far as I'm concerned. But look at the annihilatory logic at home in your nationalism perpetuated by the so-called Islamic Republic of Pakistan. So just...
Yeah, absolutely. And if I may, then hearing you speak out, it makes me think that it's all the more important, you know, your work then to think back to, which you didn't focus on today so much, which is to trace the kind of ecological thought, the sort of longer histories of ecological thought in the poetry of the region, or in sort of literatures and knowledges of the region, in the poetry literatures of the region, right? And we do have, and which is to sort of excavate. So what you were saying, that it's not that these subjects are not simply to be constituted as objects or subjects of pedagogy. They need to be taught how to look after, whether to be better pastoralists or agrarian subjects or caretakers, but that there is sort of altogether different epistemes and visions and imaginaries and languages of relating to environment and well-being, right?
What does dignity mean?
Right.
What does it mean to be connected to your land?
Right. But in going back to the question then of kind of poetics and poetic imaginary, we do have a bunch more questions about those. So if I may just pose those back to you, and they kind of go in a few different directions. So one from Sirat Fatima in Lahore, who asks, what about the ethno-linguistic politics within poetic public resistance? Is there a conscious, unconscious hierarchy of languages within this realm? I ask this as linguistic conflicts have had long-term geopolitical impacts on the history of Pakistan after 1947. For example, the Bengali language movement. So that was her question. That was the question. There was a brief, specific question from someone at some point in the conversation, which asked very specifically about the impact of 1971 on the 1971 war on Pakistan, and if that has any bearing on
Yes, it does.
Gilgit-Baltistan, and more the kind of affective story, I suppose you're telling here. Relatedly, there was another poetry identity, national identity sort of questions. From Naz Fatima, I would like to ask, to what extent has poetry as a tool helped in weaving the region into one nationalistic entity and identity? Secondly, how similar is the poetry to that of Iqbal, that was exclusively based on the essence of self and identity of Ummah?
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Maybe we'll wrap up with these last three questions, I think.
Sure, yes. I think
Unless
that's
there
all
are
we'll
more,
have time
let me
for
take all
now.
of them together.
Sure.
कोई और सवाल है urgent?
No, I mean, as I've, I can reiterate my apology again if I've missed out any, but thank you all for your very active participation.
Yeah, and thank you for the chat messages as well. To the
thank you for, no thank yous for disturbing our speaker.
हाँ वो फिर सही हो गए थे, दोस्त ही थे.
Okay.
I think who asked the first question, the ethno-linguistic poetic resistance wali? बहुत जबरदस्त सवाल है. Thank you for that. I think there's a very rich public sphere in Shina, there's a very rich public sphere in Wakhi, Brushiski, other languages, but Urdu becomes a sort of a common way to connect and also speak back to the state. A number of poets in my interviews, and especially the General Secretary of Halka Erbab-e-Zauq, I didn't get a chance to talk about Halka Erbab-e-Zauq, read chapter 4, where they said, why would we write in Urdu? We write because we want to be heard. And, it reminds me of, is it Adrian Rich who said, you have to write in the oppressor's language because you want to have a conversation with your oppressor. So Urdu becomes, and Urdu has a long history of progressive, thought, resistance thought. So satire, mazhamati shairi, jisko kehte hain, critical shairi, is used as a way to challenge what is perceived by Gilgiti poets as a project of prejudice. I think the word tasub is very significant here. So we think it's a state project, okay, Islamic project, Falana project, when we talk about nationalist projects. And the way they perceive this as a project of tasub, which is the local word for sectarianism, which is the meaning is prejudice. Even the edited volumes, one of the edited volumes of poetry that I had seen, which Halka Erbab-e-Zauq had put forward, was called Tarke Tahassub, the ending of prejudice, because they see it as the core of what the state has brought to Gilgit-Baltistan, right? So, different language, but I wanted to highlight the importance of talking in Urdu for some of the poets based on my interviews, and also as part of Muslim piety. The fact that insaniyat or humanism is the core of religion. I mean, when we look at anthropology of Islam, we often gravitate towards Muharram rituals or, shrines, or there's a very particular way in which we understand piety. So the link between poetry and piety is also very interesting And again, I've looked at it in other publications. 1971 again a very, very important question. It's after the so-called loss of East Pakistan that Pakistan begins to entrench northern areas more firmly within its state, because this anxiety of losing another border, right, is becomes severe. So you have the name change happen, you have the abolishing of the local princely states, you have the abolishing of the Begar system and feudal systems, which are seen very positively by people in the region. This is 1974. Between 1972 and 1974, you have huge changes in the Gilgit-Baltistani political structure. On one end, they are very necessary reforms and responded to movements on the ground. On the other hand, they also firmly incorporate the region into Pakistan. The other connection between 1971 is that in Dhaka, in Bangladesh, sadly, what is really experimented on the ground is al-Badr, al-Shams, the use of religious parties and terror wings to, to, to cause violence. As a means to oppress, as a means to create political conflict. And that model is then used in Gilgit-Baltistan very clearly in the 70s. I interviewed someone who just genuinely just admitted to me कि हाँ हमारे मेरा भी वालिद नहीं, he didn't talk about his father, he talked about someone else maybe, कि लोग बिके और बहुत सस्ते में बिके, that people sold their soul and conscience to doing this divide and conquer politics, where, and this has been used in Balochistan, we know this has been used in KP, where religion becomes a tool for division. It becomes actively a tool for perpetuating violence and hate. And we saw this in Bangladesh full scale by the military. The final question on Iqbal and national, I don't think there's a homogeneous, unanimous sort of poetic sphere. This is sort of my theoretical kind of dialogue with what the ethnographic experience on the ground was giving to me, was causing me to rethink my ideas of sociology, of social being, of political consciousness, of what we recognize as political protest. So I don't think there is some unitarian nationalistic vision. I mean, as in any group, there is infighting, there is lots of visions, but the critique of the abuse of Islam is central. And that critique of the abuse of Islam in the name of Muslim nationhood is even more central and very, very powerful and important today in the rest of Pakistan as well.
Thank you so much, Nosheen. I think as you spoke in response to these questions, you've begun to address a question that has been posed several times that I had missed from Shahid Loan from Kashmir, who asked that you talked about securitization and desire for territory, so to speak, but wanted you to speak a little bit more about nation building in Pakistan. So I think in speaking about 71 and the impact it had on Pakistan, I think you began to address that a little bit. Thank you so much to everybody for tuning in, listening, participating, asking all your questions. Thank you, Nosheen, for sharing your brilliant work and thoughts with us and giving us so much to think about. And in the true spirit of Poetic Publics, I think we will go away with not just a lot to think about, but debating and going back and forth. Last but not the least, many thanks to Grace and Stephanie at the Watson Institute for making this gathering possible.
And Shahana, I mean, we both have not done this.
No.
It's exciting, and I think I really appreciate the widening of community and audience in this very difficult moment for everybody. It's nice to explore its potential over Zoom. So thank you to everyone who has come for this.
The video of this event will be available on the Brown's Contemporary South Asia website shortly. So feel free to revisit it if you so wish. Bye, everyone. Be well.
Bye. Thank
Take
you.
care.
Khudafiz.